After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. They each created military alliances made up of nations they protected or occupied. The United States helped form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which comprised Western European allies. The Soviet Union signed the Warsaw Pact with Eastern European countries. The line between the democratic West and communist East was called the Iron Curtain. Many revolts challenging Soviet domination were extinguished with military force. The superpowers also engaged in a weapons race. Both developed nuclear weapons. To reduce the threat of war, the two sides held several disarmament talks. The one agreement was intended to limit the use of anti-ballistic missiles, or ABMs. These weapons were designed to shoot down missiles launched by hostile nations. The ABMs were considered a threat because they could give one side more protection, which might encourage it to attack. Then during the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan proposed a missile defense program called Star Wars. Other agreements limited the number of nuclear weapons that nations could maintain, which eased Cold War tensions. This period was called the Area of Détente. It ended, however, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. During the 1950s, Fidel Castro led a revolution in Cuba and became its leader. To bring down Castro's communist regime, U.S. President John F. Kennedy supported an invasion of Cuba, but the attempt failed. 1 year later, the Soviets sent nuclear missions to Cuba. Many feared a nuclear war. After the United States blockaded Cuba, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. The Soviets wanted to spread communist ideology around the globe. When Khrushchev came to power, he eased censorship and increased tolerance. However, repression returned under Leonid Brezhnev. American leaders followed a policy of containment. This was a strategy of keeping communism from spreading to other nations. In addition, a Red Scare in the United States resulted in Senator Joseph McCarthy leading an internal hunt for communists in the government and military. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, also sought out communist sympathizers. During the post-war period, U.S. businesses expanded into the global marketplace. Other nations needed goods and services to rebuild. This led to a period of economic success that changed life in the United States. During the 1950s and 1960s, recessions were brief and mild. As Americans prospered, they left the cities to live in the suburbs. This trend is called suburbanization. Also, job opportunities in the Sun Belt attracted many people to that region. By the 1970s, however, a political crisis in the Middle East made Americans aware of their dependence on imported oil. The price of oil and gas rose substantially, which meant that people had less money to buy other products. The decades of prosperity ended in 1974 with a serious recession. During the period of prosperity, African Americans and other minorities faced segregation in housing and education. They suffered from discrimination in jobs and voting. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the main civil rights leader of the 1960s. The U.S. Congress passed some civil rights legislation. Other minority groups were inspired by the movement's successes. For example, the women's rights movement helped to end much gender-based discrimination. Western Europe rebuilt after World War II. The Marshall Plan helped restore European economies by providing U.S. aid. After the war, Germany was divided between the Communist East and the Democratic West, but reunited at the end of the Cold War in 1990. Under Konrad Adenauer, West Germany's chancellor from 1949 to 1963, Germany built modern cities and re-established trade. European governments also developed programs that increased government responsibility for the needs of the people. These welfare states required high taxes to pay for their programs. During the 1980s, some leaders, such as Britain's Margaret Thatcher, reduced the role of government in the economy. Western Europe also moved closer to economic unity with the European Community, an organization dedicated to establishing free trade among its members. Japan also prospered after World War II. Its gross domestic product, or GDP, soared. Like Germany, Japan built factories. The government protected industries by raising tariffs on imported goods. This helped create a trade surplus for Japan.